Gabriel Hawthorne had it all: wealth, power, and control. But on the night of his lavish birthday party, his wife stood up in front of everyone and shattered his world. Divorce papers, half his fortune, a secret deal that would leave him bankrupt. And she had been planning it for years. The night shimmered with excess. A skyline adorned with golden lights framed the rooftop venue, a palace of glass and steel high above the city, where the air smelled of aged whiskey and success. Gabriel Hawthorne, a man who had conquered real estate, finance, and the art of indulgence, stood at the center of it all, a king among his subjects, basking in the glow of admiration and envy. His birthday party was no mere gathering. It was a spectacle, a demonstration of wealth so extravagant that even those accustomed to luxury found themselves momentarily breathless. The tables overflowed with delicacies flown in from around the world. Champagne cascaded like rivers from crystalline towers, and the guests, socialites, investors, models, and celebrities, moved through the space like characters in a carefully curated performance. Gabriel, tailored in an impeccably cut midnight blue suit, exuded the confidence of a man who had never known defeat. His arm rested possessively around the waist of a woman who, by all accounts, had already replaced the last in a long line of momentary infatuations. Isla Monroe, stunning in an emerald silk gown, basked in the attention as effortlessly as she had captured his. She played the part well: soft laughter, lingering touches, lips whispering into his ear as though the rest of the world had disappeared. She was young, ambitious, and dangerously aware of the power she wielded. A woman like Isla didn't fall in love with men like Gabriel. She fell in love with the lifestyle they provided. Across the room, standing just beyond the glow of candlelit centerpieces and flashing cameras, Eleanor Hawthorne watched in silence. There was an elegance to her presence, a refined composure that had been cultivated over years of navigating spaces where she was both revered and dismissed. She had played her role as the perfect wife, the poised partner, the woman who stood beside Gabriel at the height of his empire, smiling through gala speeches, shaking hands with men who congratulated her husband while ignoring her entirely. But tonight, she was not the wife of a billionaire. Tonight, she was something far more dangerous, a woman who had nothing left to lose. The sound of crystal clinking against crystal interrupted the hum of conversation. A toast was being made. Gabriel lifted his glass, his grin lazy, indulgent, the confidence of a man who believed the world was his playground. To another year of success, he drawled, looking down at Isla, whose lips curled into an adoring smile. The guests cheered, raising their glasses in agreement. Eleanor took a step forward, the click of her heels swallowed by the chatter, her heart steady. The speech had been rehearsed in her mind for months. Every word had been polished to perfection, sharpened into a blade designed for precision. She wasn't going to raise her voice. She wasn't going to cry. She wasn't going to beg for recognition or dignity. Those days were over. Gabriel barely noticed when she reached the edge of the gathering. He was too engrossed in the effortless way Isla leaned into him, her fingers tracing invisible patterns against the fabric of his jacket. But then Eleanor spoke. "To my husband," she said, her voice calm, carrying through the air with unnatural clarity. A ripple passed through the crowd. Conversations faltered, heads turned. Gabriel's brow furrowed slightly, confusion flickering across his features. It wasn't like Eleanor to interrupt, to command attention in a space he had claimed as his own. She lifted a single envelope, crisp and white against the backdrop of candlelight and opulence. "I wanted to give you a gift tonight, Gabriel. One that I've been preparing for quite some time." He chuckled, shaking his head as though indulging a child. "Eleanor, darling, now isn't really the time for, I've filed for divorce." Silence. A silence so absolute that it sucked the air from the room. Gabriel blinked. The words, though spoken clearly, didn't seem to register. The first reaction came not from him, but from the guests. A few gasps, a murmur rolling through the crowd like an impending storm. Isla stiffened at his side, her manicured nails tightening on the lapel of his jacket as though she could physically anchor him in place. Gabriel's smile faltered. Eleanor, composed as ever, stepped closer, placing the envelope directly in his hand. "It's done. Signed. Submitted. By this time next month, I will no longer be Eleanor Hawthorne. And you? Well, you'll be half the man you used to be." Laughter erupted from someone in the back. It was sharp, quick, before being stifled, but it was enough. Gabriel's expression darkened. He glanced down at the envelope as though it had materialized out of thin air. His fingers twitched around it. Half. The word hung in the air like a death sentence. "What the hell are you talking about?" His voice, still smooth, carried an edge that hadn't been there moments before. Eleanor tilted her head slightly, as though pitying him. "You should read the paperwork, darling. You'll find that our prenup—" She paused. A glimmer of satisfaction barely veiled beneath the surface. "Was far more beneficial to me than you ever realized." Isla, shifting uncomfortably, tried to step away, but Gabriel tightened his grip around her wrist, his knuckles white. "This is a joke," he snapped, but there was an uncertainty creeping into his tone, a break in the perfect composure he had carried for years. Eleanor let him drown in it for a moment before offering the final blow. "You were always so focused on acquiring things, on controlling people, on collecting women like trophies, that you never once considered the possibility that I was watching. Planning." She turned then, just enough to glance at Isla. "I'm sure you'll enjoy his generosity while it lasts," she said, a knowing smile curving at the edges of her lips. "Though I wouldn't get too comfortable." Isla paled. Gabriel, still gripping the envelope, still staring at his wife as though seeing her for the first time, felt the floor shift beneath him. The night had started as a celebration of his power, his wealth, his control. But in a matter of minutes, Eleanor had rewritten the script. This was no longer his stage. This was no longer his moment. This was his reckoning. Imagine building an empire only to watch it slip through your fingers in a single night. What would you do if your entire life was dismantled in front of everyone who once admired you? Let us know in the comments. Would you fight back, or would you walk away? And don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories like this. The party had turned into something unrecognizable. Just moments ago, the music had been loud, laughter had echoed across the rooftop, and the air had been thick with the scent of money, champagne, and expensive perfume. Now, there was nothing but the heavy weight of silence pressing down on everyone. Guests stood frozen in place, waiting for someone to speak, for something to break the unbearable tension that Eleanor's announcement had left hanging in the air. The men exchanged knowing glances, a few murmured behind half-empty glasses, while the women, some smirking, others sympathetic, observed the unfolding scene like spectators in a gladiator match. Gabriel Hawthorne felt the world tilt slightly beneath his feet. The words still lingered, vibrating through his skull, yet they made no sense. Divorce. Half. She had taken half. He gripped the envelope tighter, as if he could crush the reality out of it with sheer force. Eleanor, standing there in her floor-length gown, the very image of composure, had just publicly disassembled the life he had so carefully built. He was still struggling to process it when he felt Isla slowly peel herself away from his grasp, an instinctive reaction, as if she already sensed the sinking ship and was calculating how fast she could abandon it. He turned, his breath sharp, his anger rising. "You can't be serious," he said, his voice still carrying that rich, commanding tone, though there was a crack in it now, a slight tremor. "Eleanor, this isn't how we do things. You want a divorce? Fine. But this," he waved the envelope in the air, "this isn't how it works." Eleanor smiled, the kind of smile that sent a cold chill down his spine. "No, Gabriel, this isn't how you do things. But I've spent years watching you rewrite the rules whenever it suited you. I figured it was time to do the same." His jaw clenched, his breath coming in shallow waves. This was not how the night was supposed to go. This was his birthday, his night, his kingdom. He had built his empire from nothing, had turned himself into a man people envied, respected, and feared. He had been the one making the decisions, the one choosing who stayed and who left. Eleanor had never been the one in control. Not until now. Somewhere in the back of his mind, a memory surfaced. A reminder of how this had all begun. Their marriage had been a perfect match on paper. Gabriel, the self-made billionaire, relentless in his ambition, and Eleanor, the epitome of old money, elegance, and power. They had been the ultimate power couple, admired, envied, imitated. When they had first married, he had looked at her as an asset, a woman who gave him access to the kind of circles that would have otherwise taken him years to infiltrate. He hadn't been blind to her intelligence, her sharp wit, her ability to command a room without saying much at all. But he had also never seen her as a threat. She had been his partner, yes, but never his equal. Not once, in all the years they had been together, had he believed she would ever leave. He had always assumed that she, like so many others, would tolerate his indiscretions, his arrogance, his need for control, because, in the end, she had everything. The money, the name, the lifestyle. And yet, as he stood there, with the weight of the divorce documents in his hand, he realized something chilling. He had never really known her at all. Eleanor tilted her head slightly, studying him as if she could see the very thoughts forming in his mind. I gave you years, Gabriel. Years to do the right thing. Years to remember who you married. But you never did you? You spent our entire marriage believing that no matter what you did, I would always be here. His mouth opened, words hanging on the edge of his tongue, but none of them came out. He had no defense. Not really. Isla, who had been silent this entire time, finally found her voice. This is ridiculous, she muttered, barely above a whisper. She looked between Gabriel and Eleanor, her mind working quickly to decide which side of this was the safest to be on. I mean, no one actually divorces like this. Not in public, not like this. Eleanor turned to her, eyes steady, unwavering. Oh, sweetheart, she said, voice dripping with something dangerously close to amusement. You really thought you were winning, didn't you? The younger woman flinched. Gabriel exhaled sharply, dragging a hand down his face. This is between us, he ground out, his voice lower now, more controlled. He was trying to regain some of the dominance he had lost, trying to gather the scattered pieces of his composure. If you want to discuss this, fine. But not here. Not like this. Eleanor's smile didn't waver. Oh, Gabriel, she mused, tilting her head, her gaze cold and knowing. You lost the privilege of privacy when you paraded her around in front of me like I was nothing. Like I was some minor inconvenience instead of the woman who helped build you. You want discretion? You should have thought about that before you made a mockery of our marriage. Gabriel knew then that there was no turning back. She wasn't just leaving. She wasn't just taking half. She was making sure everyone knew. The whispers were getting louder. His business partners exchanged glances, already calculating the implications of this scandal. Some of the women in the room smiled, some outright grinned, while others watched with rapt curiosity. There was no sympathy here, just entertainment. Eleanor straightened her posture, preparing to deliver the final blow. And just in case you're thinking about damage control, I should mention, she let the words hang for a moment, savoring the weight of them. The divorce isn't the only thing I've been planning. I've also made arrangements regarding your business. Gabriel stiffened. The room had gone completely still again, as though even the chandeliers had stopped flickering, the city beyond the glass no longer humming with life. He felt it before she even said the words. You should probably check the latest market reports, Eleanor continued, her voice like velvet wrapping around steel. By now, the board has already received my recommendations. I think you'll find that your position isn't as untouchable as you once believed. His stomach turned. He was still struggling to comprehend how the night had gone from one of celebration to one of ruin. He had thought he had years, decades even, of absolute control. He had thought that Eleanor, composed and reserved as she was, would never dare to move against him. That she was simply another piece in the empire he had built. But she wasn't. She never had been. And now, standing before him with the entire world watching, she was proving just how wrong he had been. Gabriel Hawthorne felt the air shift around him, as if the very foundation of his world had cracked beneath his feet. The laughter, the music, the warm glow of candlelight, it was all still there, but it no longer felt like his. The eyes of the guests bore into him, waiting, watching, some with barely concealed amusement, others with thinly veiled horror. The whispers had already begun, words tumbling through the crowd like wildfire. Eleanor had delivered her announcement with the precision of a seasoned strategist, and now the battlefield had changed. This was no longer his party. It was her reckoning. Beside him, Isla Monroe stiffened, her fingers twitching slightly at her side. Just moments ago, she had been the centerpiece of the night, radiant in emerald silk, her laughter soft and intoxicating, her lips painted in the perfect shade of temptation. She had curled herself against him, knowing exactly how to lean in, how to touch his arm just enough to suggest intimacy, without seeming too obvious, how to make every other woman in the room feel just a little less important. She was a master at the game, and Gabriel had indulged in the illusion, feeding off the energy she exuded, enjoying the way she made him feel invincible. But now, the spell had been broken. Eleanor's voice still lingered in the air, crisp and unwavering. "I've filed for divorce. I've taken half. I've made arrangements regarding your business." Those words, so calmly spoken, had torn through him like a blade. Gabriel had built his empire on control, on strategy, on always being a step ahead. And yet, standing there, clutching the divorce papers in his hand, he felt blindsided, exposed. He exhaled sharply, his pulse hammering beneath his skin. The silence stretched, thick and unbearable, until finally, he turned toward Isla, needing to anchor himself, to reclaim some semblance of dominance. But when he met her gaze, something inside him tightened. There was hesitation in her eyes. Not shock, not anger, not loyalty. Hesitation. Gabriel's grip on the papers tightened. "This doesn't change anything," he muttered, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "It's a stunt. That's all. We'll handle it." Isla blinked, as if forcing herself to reorient. But there was a flicker of something behind her perfect exterior, calculation. "Half your fortune is gone," she said quietly, her voice lacking its usual silkiness. "Gabriel, that's not just something you handle." He narrowed his eyes. "Are you worried about me? Or about what this means for you?" She parted her lips as if to respond, but hesitated just a beat too long. That was all it took. A slow, cold realization settled over him. She was reconsidering. Of course she was. He should have known better. Isla had never promised forever. She had never pretended to be anything other than what she was. A woman who understood the currency of power and aligned herself accordingly. It had been thrilling at first, watching her maneuver through high society, watching the way she absorbed luxury as if it had been her birthright, the way she carried herself as if she had always belonged at his side. But it had always been conditional. His wealth, his status, his ability to offer her the world. These were the things that had kept her close. And now, in the span of minutes, those things had been compromised. His jaw clenched. "I wouldn't get too ahead of yourself," he said, his voice sharp, clipped. "Nothing's final yet." Isla gave him a long, careful look. "You're sure about that?" Gabriel didn't respond. He didn't need to. The hesitation in her eyes deepened. He could see the wheels turning in her mind, the calculations shifting. He had witnessed it before in others. Business partners weighing their investments, allies reconsidering their loyalties. Isla had always been a step ahead in her own way, knowing when to lean in, when to pull back. And right now, he could feel it. She was already stepping away. He turned slightly, scanning the room. The guests were still watching, though some had begun to return to their drinks, feigning normalcy while their ears remained tuned to every detail. A few of his investors exchanged murmured conversations in the far corner, their expressions unreadable. He knew how this worked. He had been in this world long enough to understand the weight of perception, the way power could shift in an instant. And right now, he was bleeding. He needed to fix this. Quickly, Gabriel turned back to Isla, lowering his voice, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "This isn't the time for second-guessing," he said. "You're with me. That hasn't changed." She studied him for a moment, her expression unreadable. Then, finally, she exhaled, forcing a small smile onto her lips. "Of course," she murmured. But he didn't believe her. And neither did she. The evening pressed on, though the energy had shifted. The music resumed, softer now, the conversations quieter, more controlled. Some guests still danced, still laughed, still toasted their glasses, but there was an undercurrent of something else now, speculation. The night was no longer about Gabriel's birthday. It was about the fallout. He moved through the room with practiced ease, shaking hands, nodding at familiar faces, doing his best to maintain the illusion of control. He refused to let them see the cracks. But Isla was slipping. It was in the way she moved, the way her attention drifted toward the exit, the way she no longer leaned into him the way she had earlier in the night. She was weighing her options, considering the headlines, the implications. And then, finally, she turned to him, offering an apologetic smile that was anything but sincere. "I should go," she said, her voice laced with forced regret. "I think it's best if you handle this privately." Gabriel stared at her. She wasn't even trying to hide it now. He should have been furious. Should have said something to make her stay. Should have demanded her loyalty, reminded her of everything he had given her. But he didn't, because deep down, he already knew the truth. She had never truly belonged to him. He had been a means to an end, an experience, an indulgence. And now, as the weight of consequence finally settled over his life, she was doing what she had always been prepared to do. She was leaving. He watched as she turned, her heels clicking softly against the marble, her dress flowing behind her like a whisper of something fleeting. She moved with the same grace she always had, her posture perfect, her exit seamless. And she didn't look back. Gabriel exhaled, the sound quiet, controlled. Fine, let her go. He had survived worse. But as the evening stretched on, as the party faded into the background, as the whispers continued to swirl around him, an unsettling thought crept into his mind. For the first time in his life, he wasn't sure if he could win this time. Gabriel could still feel the weight of the evening pressing down on him, the echoes of murmured conversations, the eyes that followed him through the room like shadows waiting to swallow him whole. The party had not ended, at least not officially, but the energy had shifted in a way that could never be reversed. He had once thrived in environments like this, in spaces where his name carried an unshakable power, where people measured their worth by how close they stood to him. But now, that power was slipping, unraveling in a way he could not stop. He forced a breath through his nose, turning away from the dwindling crowd. Some of his business associates had already started to make quiet exits, leaving behind only those who still found amusement in the unfolding disaster. He spotted Eleanor in the distance, poised and unmoved, speaking to a small group with the same ease and grace she had always carried. She was unaffected, unbothered, untouched by the damage she had inflicted. Gabriel clenched his jaw, his fingers curling into his palm. She thought this was over. She thought she had won. But he wasn't done. He moved without hesitation, crossing the space between them with the kind of presence that had always commanded attention. Conversation stalled as people noticed his approach, their gazes shifting between him and Eleanor, anticipation thick in the air. When he reached her, she was already looking at him, her expression unreadable. "Enjoying yourself?" he asked, his voice smooth despite the anger simmering beneath it. She tilted her head slightly, as if considering the question. Immensely, a muscle in his jaw twitched. "We're not doing this here." Eleanor raised a single brow, as if amused by the suggestion that he still had any say in the matter. "Oh, Gabriel," she said, her tone laced with something dangerously close to pity. "We already are doing this here." He exhaled sharply, forcing himself to remain composed. "You want a divorce? Fine. Take whatever settlement you think you're entitled to and walk away. But you've made your point. There's no reason to keep putting on a show." Eleanor studied him for a moment, then took a slow sip of her champagne. "You still don't get it, do you?" she murmured, tilting the glass slightly as she swirled the liquid inside. "You think this is about a settlement? You think this is about money?" Gabriel frowned, his patience slipping. "Isn't it?" She set her glass down on the table beside her, then folded her hands together with the kind of deliberate slowness that sent a chill through him. "No," she said simply. And then, without another word, she turned to face the crowd, lifting her chin slightly as she prepared to speak. Gabriel felt his stomach tighten. The soft hum of conversation faded as people turned their attention toward her. She had done this on purpose, waited until the moment was right, ensured that she had the undivided focus of the most powerful and influential people in the room. It was the kind of move he would have once admired. Now, it made his pulse pound with something dangerously close to fear. "Ladies and gentlemen," Eleanor began, her voice carrying effortlessly through the space. "I want to thank you all for being here tonight. This has certainly been an evening to remember." A few chuckles rippled through the crowd. Gabriel remained silent, his hands tightening at his sides. "As many of you have already heard, I've made the decision to dissolve my marriage to Gabriel." She paused just long enough to let the words settle, to let the weight of them sink in. "And while I'm sure this may come as a surprise to some of you, I can assure you that it has been a long time coming." Gabriel's jaw clenched. He had always known she was capable of playing the long game, but he had underestimated just how far ahead she had been thinking. Eleanor turned slightly, her gaze meeting his for the briefest moment before she continued. I'm sure there will be plenty of speculation about why I've made this choice, but the truth is quite simple. I refuse to be disrespected. I refuse to be an afterthought. And I refuse to stand beside a man who values power more than loyalty." A murmur spread through the room. Gabriel could feel it happening in real time. The slow but undeniable shift in perception. She wasn't just leaving him. She was rewriting the narrative. Eleanor exhaled softly, as if relieved to finally say the words out loud. "And because I believe in making decisions with intention, I didn't just walk away. I made sure that when I left, I took exactly what I was owed." Gabriel felt the heat of a dozen eyes on him, the weight of their judgment pressing against his skin like fire. She was enjoying this. She was enjoying every second of his downfall. He took a step closer, his voice low, warning. "Eleanor." She barely acknowledged him. "I don't expect sympathy. I don't expect approval. But I do expect to be remembered. Because from this moment on, I am no longer just his wife. I am Eleanor. And I am free." The words struck like a match against gasoline. A slow, deliberate applause started from the back of the room, growing in intensity as more people joined in. Some clapped because they admired her, some because they feared her, and others simply because they enjoyed the spectacle. Gabriel barely heard any of it. His blood pounded too loudly in his ears. This was supposed to be his night, his celebration, and now it had become something else entirely. Eleanor turned toward him then, her expression unreadable, but there was something in her eyes that he recognized. Finality. She wasn't coming back. The realization settled over him like a lead weight. She had won, and for the first time in his life, Gabriel didn't know what to do next. The applause still echoed in Gabriel's ears long after the sound had faded, reverberating through his skull like a cruel reminder of what had just happened. He had never felt the weight of humiliation before. Not like this. Not so profoundly that it seemed to wrap itself around his throat, suffocating him. He had been embarrassed in boardrooms, had faced temporary losses in business, had even been publicly criticized in the press, but nothing compared to this. This wasn't just a misstep or a scandal to be buried under a new headline. This was his entire empire being unraveled in real time, in front of the very people who had once envied him. The party was no longer a celebration, it was a funeral. And the man being buried was the version of Gabriel Hawthorne that had once believed himself untouchable. He had stood there, frozen, as Eleanor turned the page of their story, closing the chapter in which he was the powerful, dominant husband, and leaving him as nothing more than a footnote in the life she had carefully designed for herself. He had watched as she stepped away, as the guests parted to let her through, some offering her sympathetic smiles, others glancing at him with a mixture of amusement and morbid curiosity. He had built this world, and now it had turned on him. He needed to move, to regain control, to salvage what little remained of his dignity, but his body refused to obey. His pulse thundered in his ears, his mind racing through possibilities, through calculations, searching for an angle, an escape. He had lawyers. He had power. He had resources. This wasn't the end. It couldn't be. "Sir," a voice cut through the fog of his thoughts, sharp and professional. It took him a second to recognize it. Henry, his personal attorney. The man had appeared beside him like a ghost, his expression unreadable, but the slight tension in his jaw told Gabriel that the news he was about to receive would only make things worse. "Not now," Gabriel muttered, adjusting the cuffs of his jacket, trying to maintain some semblance of control, some illusion that he was still the man people feared. Henry hesitated. "Sir, you need to see this." There was something in his voice, something urgent enough to snap Gabriel out of his haze. He exhaled sharply, then nodded once, following Henry as they moved away from the remaining guests, slipping into a quieter corner of the venue where the air was just as heavy, but the scrutiny was less suffocating. "Talk," Gabriel ordered, his patience thin. Henry didn't sugarcoat it. He never did. "It's worse than we thought. Eleanor didn't just take half your personal assets. She's positioned herself to take a significant portion of the company as well." The words were like a slap to the face. Gabriel stiffened, his entire body coiling like a spring ready to snap. "That's impossible." The prenup was airtight when it came to personal wealth. Henry interrupted, his tone measured but firm. "But not the business. The company was built after your marriage, Gabriel. That makes it marital property." Gabriel's vision blurred for a second. He had never once considered the possibility that Eleanor would touch the business. The money, yes. The houses, the cars, the ridiculous excess she had always rolled her eyes at but enjoyed nonetheless. But the company? That was his. It had always been his. It was the one thing he had created from nothing, the empire that had turned him into a household name. No, he said, the denial automatic, reflexive. She wouldn't. She already has, Henry said grimly, handing Gabriel a folder. The divorce filings include a claim to 38% of Hawthorne Global. She's negotiated deals with key investors to leverage voting power against you. You're looking at the very real possibility of losing control over your own company. Gabriel's fingers clenched around the folder, his breath shallow. This couldn't be happening. He flipped open the file, scanning the documents with the sharp precision that had made him one of the most ruthless dealmakers in the industry. The words blurred together, but the key points burned into his mind like scars. She had been planning this for a long time. The paper trail was meticulous. The agreements with stakeholders, the gradual acquisition of shares through secondary holdings, the strategic alliances she had formed behind his back. She had been moving pieces on the board while he had been too distracted playing his own games. His stomach turned. How long have you known? Henry hesitated. That was enough of an answer. Gabriel slammed the folder shut. Jesus Christ. She didn't just leave, Gabriel. She left with power. Real power. Henry's voice was low, almost apologetic. And she's already using it. Gabriel's mind raced through scenarios, through countermoves, through ways to turn the tide back in his favor. He had built his career on strategy, on always being 2 steps ahead. But this wasn't business. This wasn't a negotiation where he could walk into a boardroom and intimidate his way into a better deal. This was personal. And Eleanor had just proven that she was better at this game than he had ever given her credit for. The room suddenly felt too small, too loud, too full of people who had just witnessed the moment his invincibility cracked. He needed air, needed space, needed to figure out how the hell he was going to fix this. Without another word, he turned and strode toward the exit, ignoring the curious glances, the lingering whispers. He could still feel their eyes on him as he pushed through the heavy doors and stepped out into the cool night air. The city stretched before him, glittering and endless, but for the first time in years, it didn't feel like his kingdom. It felt like a cage. He exhaled sharply, his breath curling into the air. He wasn't done. Not by a long shot. Eleanor thought she had won, thought she had stripped him of his power. But she underestimated him. She always had. This wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. Gabriel stepped onto the balcony of his penthouse, the city sprawling beneath him like a kingdom he no longer controlled. His grip on the whiskey glass was tight, his jaw locked, his mind a battlefield of calculations and disbelief. He had spent the past few hours locked in his study, drowning in documents, financial reports, and legal filings, searching for an oversight, a flaw, a single miscalculation in Eleanor's plan that he could exploit. But there was none. She had executed this perfectly. Every move was calculated, every legal loophole closed, every potential ally of his either neutralized or swayed to her side. He took a slow sip of his drink, letting the burn chase away the frustration. This was beyond money now. This was power. And Eleanor had just demonstrated that she had more of it than he ever thought possible. She had always been sharp, always observant, but he had underestimated her. He had assumed she was content living in his shadow, that she preferred being the quiet force behind his empire rather than a contender for the throne itself. He had been wrong. His phone buzzed on the table beside him. Henry. Again. He ignored it. He already knew what his attorney was going to say. More bad news, more legal obstacles, more reminders that his world was crumbling faster than he could hold it together. He wasn't interested in another lecture about damage control. Instead, he turned toward the television screen mounted on the far wall. A news anchor was reporting the latest developments, her expression neutral, professional, but he could hear the thin layer of intrigue beneath her tone. Sources close to the Hawthorne Global Board confirmed that the ongoing divorce between Gabriel and Eleanor Hawthorne has triggered major shifts within the company. With Eleanor securing a 38% claim to the corporation, key investors are reconsidering their alliances. Some insiders suggest that Eleanor's strategic partnerships could lead to significant changes in leadership. Gabriel muted the television, his pulse spiking. This was worse than he had anticipated. Losing half his personal wealth had been a blow, but losing control of the company? That was war. He had spent decades turning Hawthorne Global into one of the most powerful real estate empires in the country. His name was synonymous with success, with dominance, with influence that extended far beyond boardrooms and market shares. And now, in a matter of weeks, Eleanor had put herself in a position to take it all away. He grabbed his phone and dialed Henry. The attorney picked up immediately. "I was starting to think you were ignoring me," Henry said dryly. "Give me a reason not to," Gabriel snapped. "Tell me something I can use." A pause, then a sigh. "There's no easy fix here, Gabriel. Eleanor didn't just take shares, she built alliances. Quietly, over time. She's locked in agreements with enough stakeholders that if she pushes for a vote of no confidence, you could lose your position as CEO." Gabriel's grip on the phone tightened. "And you're telling me there's nothing we can do to stop it?" "There are options," Henry admitted, "but none that won't cost you even more. You could try to buy back enough shares to regain majority control, but Eleanor anticipated that. She's already driven up the market value, and the stakeholders willing to sell are demanding double what their shares were worth last month. If you make those purchases, you'll be draining what's left of your liquidity." Gabriel exhaled slowly, his mind racing. He could fight this. He had fought worse. He had climbed from nothing, built his empire through sheer force of will, survived ruthless business rivals, economic downturns, scandals. He wasn't going to be brought down by his own wife. Then another thought struck him. "What about the board?" he asked. "They're not going to side with her over me." Henry hesitated. "That's complicated." Gabriel straightened. "Complicated how?" "The board respects you," Henry said carefully. "But they also see the numbers. And right now, Eleanor is positioning herself as the smarter bet. She's been meeting with key figures behind closed doors, securing their support. Some of them believe she offers a more stable future for the company. They think she's more calculated, less volatile." Gabriel laughed, a harsh, humorless sound. "Less volatile? You can't say this surprises you," Henry muttered. "Gabriel, you've built an empire on power moves and public spectacle. Eleanor has built hers on precision and patience. They're looking at her and seeing an alternative that doesn't involve chaos." Gabriel closed his eyes for a brief second. He could feel it slipping through his fingers. His company, his control, his name. He had spent his life ensuring that no one could take what was his, that he was the one pulling the strings, the one dictating the game. But now, Eleanor had rewritten the rules. He turned back to the cityscape, his mind cycling through options, searching for a way to regain the upper hand. There was always a way. He just had to find it. "Set up a meeting," he said finally. "With who?" "With Eleanor." Henry paused. "Are you sure that's a good idea?" Gabriel smirked, though there was no amusement behind it. "She wanted a fight. Let's give her one." The next morning, he arrived at the private conference room where Eleanor had agreed to meet him. She was already there, waiting, seated at the long glass table with a calm, unreadable expression. She looked entirely in control, not just of herself, but of the situation. She didn't fidget, didn't glance at her phone, didn't look around the room as if expecting a fight. She simply watched him as he entered, her gaze steady, assessing. Gabriel sat across from her, resting his hands on the table. "You've made your point," he said evenly. Eleanor raised a brow. "Have I? You want to take your money and walk away? Fine. But you and I both know that going after the company is unnecessary." She tilted her head slightly, considering his words. "Unnecessary?" she echoed. "Gabriel, you built Hawthorne Global while we were married. I was there through every expansion, every strategic move. I sat through meetings where men ignored me while they congratulated you for decisions I helped you make. And now you think I should walk away with nothing but a check?" He exhaled slowly. "This isn't about money for you, is it?" Eleanor's lips curved, just slightly. "No," she admitted. Gabriel leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "Then what do you want?" Eleanor studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then, finally, she spoke. "I want you to know what it feels like," she said softly. "To have something you built taken away from you. To be dismissed, underestimated. To watch people who once relied on you suddenly see you as disposable. I want you to understand the weight of losing control." Gabriel inhaled sharply. She wasn't just trying to leave. She was trying to destroy him. The realization settled over him like a slow-moving storm, dark, and inevitable. Eleanor Hawthorne wasn't just walking away. She was taking everything with her. Gabriel Hawthorne had spent his entire life believing that everything, wealth, power, influence, could be controlled. That the people in his orbit, the ones who clung to him, admired him, followed him, were there because he allowed them to be. He had never questioned their loyalty, never once considered that the foundation of his world was built on something as fragile as perception. Until now. The party was over, the guests long gone, but the remnants of the disaster lingered in the cold silence of his penthouse. The once vibrant space, filled with laughter and the intoxicating hum of admiration, now felt empty. The city stretched out beyond the glass walls, glittering and endless. But for the first time in his life, Gabriel felt like an outsider looking in, as if the world had continued moving without him. He poured himself a drink, the amber liquid swirling in the glass, steadying his nerves as his mind raced. Eleanor had blindsided him, stripping away not just his wealth, but his reputation, his control. The power he had once wielded effortlessly had slipped through his fingers, and the people who had once stood beside him were already scattering like rats from a sinking ship. And that included Isla. His grip tightened around the glass at the thought of her. Isla Monroe, the woman who had been draped over him just hours ago, whispering empty promises, playing the role she knew best. She had been a distraction, a beautiful ornament to his life, someone who understood the game and played it well. But as soon as the rules had changed, as soon as the ground beneath him had begun to shake, she had done what all opportunists did. She had started looking for the exit. He checked his phone again, his jaw clenching as he stared at the unanswered texts. The message thread that had once been filled with flirtation, with late-night rendezvous and stolen moments, was now met with silence. She was waiting, calculating, watching to see how this played out before making her next move. The thought made his blood run cold. He downed the rest of his drink and grabbed his coat, slipping out of the penthouse and into the night. The streets of Manhattan were alive, indifferent to his unraveling. He had always found comfort in the city's relentless energy, in the knowledge that no matter what happened, it would keep moving. But tonight, it felt different. Tonight, it felt like it was moving without him. He arrived at Isla's apartment without thinking, his steps driven by something between anger and desperation. He wasn't the kind of man who begged. He wasn't the kind of man who chased. But right now, he needed to know, needed to hear it from her. He knocked once, then twice. A pause. Then, finally, the door cracked open. Isla stood there in a silk robe, her golden hair cascading down her shoulders, her expression unreadable. For a moment, she didn't speak, simply looking at him as if debating whether or not to let him in. Then, with a quiet sigh, she stepped aside. Gabriel entered, his gaze sweeping across the apartment. It was still as pristine as ever, every detail carefully curated, designed to impress. It was a place built for someone who had no intention of staying forever. She closed the door behind her, crossing her arms. "Gabriel," she murmured, her voice softer than he expected. He turned to face her. "Say it." She blinked. "Say what?" "You're leaving," he said, his voice even, controlled. "You're already planning your exit. So say it." A flicker of something crossed her face. Guilt, maybe. Or maybe just the annoyance of being caught. "Gabriel." She exhaled, running a hand through her hair. "You know this isn't what I signed up for." His chest tightened. "What exactly did you sign up for, Isla?" She hesitated. "Not this. Not scandal. Not watching you lose everything." There it was. The brutal honesty of it. Not love. Not loyalty. Not even an attempt at pretending. Just self-preservation. He took a step closer, watching her carefully. "You think I'm losing everything?" She didn't answer immediately. Then, with a quiet certainty, she nodded. "Yes." A sharp laugh escaped him, but there was no humor in it. "You didn't hesitate, did you? The second things got complicated, you started looking for your next move." She lifted her chin slightly, something cold settling into her gaze. "Don't pretend you're surprised, Gabriel. We both knew what this was." He clenched his jaw. "Did we?" "You're a businessman," she said smoothly, shifting her weight. "You, of all people, should understand value. The second something loses it, you cut your losses." His fists curled at his sides. "And that's what I am now? A loss." She exhaled softly. "You're not the man I met," she admitted, her voice softer now, almost pitying. You were untouchable, unshakable. You walked into a room, and people listened. Now they're watching you fall. The words hit harder than he wanted them to. He had spent years cultivating his image, ensuring that he was seen as powerful, untouchable. And yet, standing here in front of Isla, he realized how quickly that perception had changed. She was already done with him, already looking ahead. And suddenly, he saw it all so clearly. This wasn't just about her leaving. This was about the fact that she had never really been his to begin with. He took a slow step back, exhaling sharply through his nose. I should have seen this coming. Isla didn't respond. She didn't need to. He turned toward the door, pausing only briefly before glancing back at her. I hope you find what you're looking for, Isla. Just remember, this city doesn't forgive. And it sure as hell doesn't forget. For a moment, something flickered in her eyes. Regret. Maybe. But it was gone just as quickly as it appeared. Goodbye, Gabriel, she said quietly. And just like that, it was over. He stepped out into the hallway, the door clicking shut behind him, sealing whatever they had into the past. He stood there for a long moment, staring at nothing, feeling the weight of the night settle over him. First Eleanor, now Isla. One by one, the pieces of his life were being stripped away, leaving nothing but the raw, undeniable truth. He was alone. For the first time in his life, Gabriel Hawthorne was truly alone. And the worst part? He wasn't sure if he could fix it. Gabriel sat alone in the dimly lit study of his penthouse, a heavy crystal glass resting between his fingers, the amber liquid inside barely touched. He had never been the kind of man to drink in solitude. Whiskey was meant to be enjoyed in victory, shared in private celebrations of the deals he had closed, the battles he had won. But tonight, it tasted different. Bitter. Hollow. Like a reminder of everything that had slipped through his fingers. The city stretched beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows, still alive, still breathing, but it no longer felt like it belonged to him. His empire had been built on confidence, on certainty, on the unshakable belief that he would always be the man in control. But Eleanor had destroyed that illusion with nothing more than a few signatures and a well-calculated exit. Isla had confirmed it with her absence. And now, as he sat there, the weight of his losses pressing down on him, Gabriel could feel the cracks deepening, spreading through the foundation of his world like fractures in glass. His phone buzzed against the mahogany desk, the sound sharp in the silence. He ignored it at first, but then it vibrated again. And again, a relentless demand for attention. He sighed, setting down the glass before reaching for the device, his eyes narrowing at the caller ID. Henry. Again. Gabriel exhaled through his nose before answering. What now? Henry's voice was tight, controlled, but there was something beneath it, something tense, something urgent. We have a problem. Gabriel let out a humorless laugh, leaning back in his chair. Just one. This isn't the time for sarcasm, Gabriel. Henry snapped, and for the first time, there was a sharp edge to his voice, something that made Gabriel's grip tighten around the phone. We've been monitoring movements within the company, and Eleanor isn't just sitting on those shares. She's making moves, aggressive ones. She's calling meetings, speaking with board members, pushing for changes. Gabriel felt his jaw lock, his free hand curling into a fist against the armrest. What kind of changes? Henry hesitated. Gabriel sat up straighter. Henry, the attorney sighed. She's laying the groundwork to push you out. The words landed like a punch to the gut, but Gabriel barely reacted. He had suspected it, had seen the writing on the wall since the moment Eleanor had served him with the divorce papers. But hearing it confirmed, spoken aloud in Henry's steady voice, made it real in a way he hadn't been ready for. His own company, his legacy, and she was coming for it. Gabriel pressed his fingers to his temple, inhaling deeply before speaking. What are our options? Henry didn't hesitate this time. We fight. We secure the remaining board members before she does. We leverage your influence. Remind them who built this company, who they owe their success to. But, Gabriel, this isn't just about business anymore. Eleanor isn't playing by the rules you're used to. Gabriel's lips curled into a smirk, though there was no humor behind it. Oh, I know that. Henry exhaled. Then you also know that if you don't act fast, she's going to take everything. Gabriel knew. He had always prided himself on being ahead of the game, on anticipating threats before they could become problems. But he had been blindsided, distracted by his own arrogance, by the belief that Eleanor would never dare to move against him. That mistake had cost him half his fortune. It had cost him his reputation. He wasn't about to let it cost him his company. Set up the meetings, Gabriel ordered, his voice firm, steady. I want names, numbers, leverage. Whatever it takes. Henry hesitated. Gabriel, do it. A pause. Then, finally, a quiet, all right. Gabriel ended the call and tossed the phone onto the desk, his pulse hammering beneath his skin. The anger was there now, burning in his chest, simmering just beneath the surface. He had been knocked down before, but he had never stayed down. And he wasn't about to start now. The door to his study creaked open, and he turned sharply, his muscles tensing. His house staff knew better than to bother him when he was in this mood, which meant the person standing in the doorway wasn't one of them. Eleanor. She stepped inside without invitation, her posture relaxed, her expression unreadable. She was dressed impeccably, as always, her elegance effortless, her confidence unshaken. She didn't look like a woman who had just detonated a bomb in his life. She looked like a woman who was exactly where she was meant to be. Gabriel leaned back in his chair, studying her. Didn't expect to see you here, he murmured, his voice laced with something close to amusement. I figured you'd be too busy planning my funeral. Eleanor arched a brow, closing the door behind her before walking further into the room. I wanted to see how you were handling it, she admitted, tilting her head slightly. Losing, I mean. Gabriel smirked, though it didn't reach his eyes. Is that what this is? You checking to see if I've broken yet? She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she took a slow, deliberate breath, her gaze sweeping over him as if assessing, calculating. Then, finally, she spoke. I wanted to give you a chance. His smirk faltered. A chance. To step aside gracefully, she clarified, her voice smooth, even. To take what's left and walk away before this gets worse for you. Gabriel let out a short, sharp laugh, shaking his head. You really think I'm just going to roll over? Let you take everything? Eleanor's lips curved slightly. I think you know how this ends, Gabriel. His jaw tightened. You want my company, he said slowly. You want my name, my legacy. But let's get something straight, Eleanor. You wouldn't even have those shares if it weren't for me. You wouldn't be in those board meetings, wouldn't have a seat at that table, if I hadn't put you there. Her eyes darkened slightly, but she didn't flinch. And that's exactly why I deserve to be there. You spent years underestimating me, Gabriel. Years treating me like I was an accessory to your success instead of a partner. I learned from you. I watched you manipulate, strategize, dominate. And now, I'm using everything you taught me against you. Gabriel inhaled sharply, forcing himself to stay composed. Eleanor stepped closer, lowering her voice. I'm not here to fight with you, Gabriel. I'm here to tell you that this doesn't have to get uglier than it already is. You can take what's left and start over somewhere else. Or you can stay and let me finish what I started. He held her gaze, searching for any sign of hesitation, any crack in her armor. But there was none. She meant every word. And for the first time, Gabriel felt something he had never allowed himself to feel before. Doubt. Eleanor turned to leave, pausing only briefly at the door. Think about it, she murmured. Because the next time we talk, the choice won't be yours anymore. And then she was gone. Gabriel sat there, staring at the empty doorway, his pulse steady but his mind racing. He had built this empire, and he would be damned if he let Eleanor take it from him. Gabriel had spent his entire life believing that power was something he could hold in his hands, mold into whatever shape suited him best, bend to his will. He had built his empire with that belief, carving his place at the top through sheer force, outmaneuvering his rivals, crushing those who dared to stand in his way. But now, as he sat in the silence of his penthouse, staring at the wreckage Eleanor had left behind, he felt something he hadn't in years, doubt. He had always been the one pulling the strings, always the one orchestrating his own victories. But now, he was the one being played. He leaned forward, rubbing his temples as Henry's voice droned through the speakerphone, listing off more names, more deals slipping through his fingers, more doors closing in his face. Gabriel had built his company from the ground up, and yet, within weeks, it was unraveling at a speed he couldn't control. Eleanor had made sure of it. She hadn't just left him. She had spent years preparing for this, waiting for the perfect moment to strike, positioning herself in ways he had never noticed. And now, he was paying for every mistake, every blind spot, every assumption that she would always be the woman standing quietly beside him, rather than the one walking away with his crown. "Gabriel, are you even listening?" Henry's voice cut through his thoughts, sharp and impatient. Gabriel exhaled, pinching the bridge of his nose. "Tell me something useful, Henry. Something I can actually use." Henry hesitated. That wasn't a good sign. "The board is moving ahead with an emergency vote," he finally admitted. "Eleanor's pushing for your removal as CEO, and she has enough backing to make it happen." Gabriel's grip tightened around the edge of the desk. "She doesn't have the majority." "Not yet," Henry said. "But she's close. Too close. If one more investor flips, you're out." Gabriel clenched his jaw. "Then we make sure that doesn't happen." Henry sighed. "Gabriel, listen to me. She planned this for years. Every move you're making now, she's already anticipated it. You need to stop thinking like a man trying to win back control and start thinking like a man who's about to lose everything." Gabriel laughed, the sound low and bitter. "I don't lose, Henry." A beat of silence. Then, Henry muttered, "Then you better find a way to remind everyone of that before it's too late." Gabriel ended the call, tossing his phone onto the desk. The tension in his muscles was almost unbearable, but he couldn't afford to give in to it. He needed to act, needed to get ahead of this. He had spent his life playing this game, had learned every trick, every manipulation, every power move. And yet, Eleanor had still beaten him to it. He had always thought of her as elegant, refined, poised, a woman made to be admired, not feared. But he had been wrong. She had spent years watching him, learning from him. And then, when the time was right, she had turned everything he had taught her against him. The realization burned, but it also sparked something inside him. If Eleanor wanted to play this game, he wasn't going to sit back and let her win. He stood, adjusting the cuffs of his shirt, smoothing out the lines of his suit. He had lost before, money, deals, investments. But this was different. This wasn't just business. This was personal. And if there was one thing Gabriel knew how to do, it was fight. The meeting was set for the following evening. A private dinner at one of the city's most exclusive clubs, where money and power collided behind closed doors, where deals were made in whispers and fortunes were decided over aged scotch and hand-rolled cigars. Gabriel arrived early, slipping past the usual pleasantries, his focus razor-sharp. He wasn't here for conversation. He was here to win. He took his seat at the long mahogany table, his eyes scanning the room, assessing the men who had once pledged loyalty to him. Some met his gaze, others looked away. The shift was subtle, but it was there. Uncertainty, hesitation. And then Eleanor walked in. She was dressed in deep emerald, the kind of color that made people notice, made them stare. It wasn't just elegance, it was a statement. She moved with quiet confidence, her expression unreadable, her chin slightly lifted as she took the seat across from him. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, finally, Gabriel leaned back, his lips curling slightly. "Enjoying yourself?" Eleanor tilted her head. "Immensely." The other board members shifted uncomfortably, glancing between them. Gabriel exhaled. "Let's get this over with." One of the investors cleared his throat. "We've heard both of your arguments," he said carefully, his tone neutral. "And while no final decisions have been made, it's clear that change is coming. The question is how we manage that transition." Gabriel's gaze didn't waver. "There is no transition. I built this company. I run this company. And I'm not going anywhere." Eleanor smiled slightly. "You built this company with my money, Gabriel." The words were soft, almost gentle, but they cut deeper than any accusation. "You built this empire on deals you wouldn't have gotten without me," she continued, her voice steady calm. "On relationships I introduced you to, on negotiations I sat through while men shook your hand and pretended I wasn't in the room. And now, you expect me to walk away and let you take credit for all of it." Gabriel clenched his jaw. "We had an agreement." "You had an assumption," she corrected. "You assumed I would always be there, standing behind you, never in front of you." He exhaled sharply, leaning forward. "What do you want, Eleanor?" She studied him for a long moment. Then, finally, she spoke. "I want you to understand what it feels like," she murmured. "To be underestimated, to be dismissed, to be treated like nothing more than an accessory to someone else's success." Gabriel's pulse hammered beneath his skin. Eleanor smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "And I want you to know that I'm not going anywhere, either." The vote happened the next morning. Gabriel was out. Eleanor was in. And for the first time in his life, Gabriel Hawthorne had lost everything. Gabriel Hawthorne sat motionless in the back seat of his car, his fingers gripping the leather armrest so tightly that his knuckles had turned white. The silence inside the vehicle was suffocating, thick with the weight of everything that had transpired. The city moved outside his window, vibrant, chaotic, indifferent to his downfall. Only hours ago, he had walked into that boardroom as a man who still believed he could salvage what remained of his empire, still convinced the people who had once pledged loyalty to him that he was the only one fit to lead. But when the final votes had been cast, he had been met not with regret or hesitation, but with cold certainty. Eleanor had orchestrated every moment of it, turning his allies against him, planting doubt in the minds of investors, positioning herself as the stable choice. She hadn't just taken his title, she had rewritten the entire narrative of who he was. He exhaled slowly, his jaw tightening as he stared at his own reflection in the window. The headlines were already circulating, the media spinning their stories with the precision of vultures descending on fresh carrion. Gabriel Hawthorne ousted from his own company. Eleanor Hawthorne takes control of billionaire husband's empire, once a titan, now a cautionary tale. The fall of Gabriel Hawthorne, the word stung, not just because they were being broadcasted to the world, but because of how easily people were willing to believe them. These were the same journalists who had once written glowing profiles about him, the same business analysts who had praised his aggressive strategies, the same investors who had once placed their faith and their money in his leadership. And now, they had turned, eager to reduce him to nothing more than a failed king, a fallen giant who had been too arrogant to see the storm coming. The car rolled to a stop at a red light, and Gabriel forced himself to take a slow, controlled breath. He wasn't finished, not by a long shot, but the first step to reclaiming what was his was understanding the battlefield. And right now, the battlefield was public perception. His phone vibrated for what felt like the 100th time, and he ignored it again. The calls had started flooding in the moment the news broke. Reporters, former allies, opportunists looking to pick apart what was left. Even Henry had called more times than he could count, no doubt trying to do damage control, to strategize a way forward. But Gabriel wasn't interested in damage control. He was interested in war. As the car neared his penthouse, he finally glanced at his phone, scrolling through the notifications. The articles were everywhere, his face plastered across screens, analysts dissecting every detail of the vote, speculating on what had led to his downfall. Some painted him as reckless, too aggressive, a leader who had refused to adapt. Others framed Eleanor as the mastermind, the woman who had quietly built her own power while her husband remained blind to the shifting tides. It didn't matter which version the public chose to believe. The damage had been done. Then, something else caught his eye, a news clip from one of the country's biggest financial networks. He tapped the screen, the audio playing through his car's speakers just as the anchor began speaking. "This is one of the most shocking corporate power shifts we've seen in years," the woman said, her expression carefully neutral, though there was a glint of intrigue in her eyes. Gabriel Hawthorne, once one of the most formidable names in real estate and finance, has been officially removed as CEO of Hawthorne Global following a strategic move by his now ex-wife, Eleanor Hawthorne. What makes this particularly fascinating is how methodically she executed this transition. While Gabriel was known for his aggressive expansion tactics and high-profile deals, Eleanor positioned herself as the more calculated, long-term visionary, securing key votes from investors who had grown wary of Gabriel's leadership style. Gabriel's fingers twitched against his knee. Sources close to the situation suggest that Eleanor's takeover has been in motion for years, with her carefully acquiring leverage and forming alliances within the company. The question now is, what happens to Gabriel Hawthorne? Is this the end of his reign, or does he have a move left to play? The clip ended, and Gabriel let the silence settle again, his mind calculating at a rapid pace. Eleanor had won the battle, there was no denying that. But the war was far from over. The car finally pulled up to his building, and the moment he saw the scene outside, his stomach turned. The press had gathered in full force, a sea of cameras, flashing lights, and microphones, all waiting for his arrival. Their voices blended into a chaotic hum, shouting questions over one another, each one eager to be the first to get a reaction from the man who had just lost everything. "Mr. Hawthorne, do you have any comments about the board's decision?" Are the rumors true that Eleanor Hawthorne will be restructuring the company? How does it feel to be removed from your own empire? The last question sent a sharp bolt of anger through him, but he kept his face impassive. He had two choices. He could walk through those doors, head held high, and let them dissect every movement, every flicker of emotion, turning his humiliation into headlines. Or he could do what they least expected. The driver turned to him, awaiting instruction. Gabriel exhaled through his nose. Keep driving. The car pulled away from the curb, leaving the chaos behind, but he could still feel the weight of their eyes, the anticipation of the world waiting to see him break. They wouldn't get the satisfaction. Not now. Not ever. Instead of heading back to the penthouse, Gabriel had the driver take him to his private office, one of the few spaces left untouched by Eleanor's reach. The moment he stepped inside, he poured himself a drink, the ice clinking against the glass as he took a slow sip. He needed to think, needed to regroup. He had always been a man who thrived in chaos, who knew how to adapt when the game changed. And this was no different. Eleanor had been patient, methodical, brilliant in her execution. He could admit that now, but if she thought this was over, she was mistaken. Gabriel sat down, loosening his tie as he pulled out a notepad, his mind already formulating a plan. He had spent his life tearing down obstacles, building something out of nothing. He wasn't about to stop now. Eleanor had underestimated him once before, believing that he would never see her coming. But this time he was ready, and he was going to take back everything she had stolen. Gabriel Hawthorne had never felt the weight of silence before. His entire life had been a symphony of power, phones ringing with urgent calls, assistants moving swiftly to carry out his commands, boardrooms filled with men waiting for his approval. But now, as he stood in his penthouse, surrounded by the cold sterility of luxury, there was nothing. No one. Just the faint hum of the city below, a world that had kept moving without him. The air felt heavier, pressing against his chest, suffocating in a way he had never known. He walked to the bar, his movements slow, calculated, as if his body was still adjusting to the reality that he no longer owned the world beneath his feet. The whiskey poured smoothly, the amber liquid catching the dim light as he raised the glass to his lips. He had never been a man who drank out of despair. Whiskey was for celebrations, for sealing deals, for marking victories. But tonight, it tasted different. It tasted like surrender. He wouldn't call it defeat. Not yet. Gabriel had spent years turning obstacles into opportunities, failures into stepping stones. He had built his name from nothing, clawed his way out of obscurity, and shaped himself into a man that others feared, admired, envied. He had been the king of his own empire, dictating the rules, controlling the narrative. And now, in the blink of an eye, it had all been stripped from him. Eleanor hadn't just taken what was hers. She had taken what was his, what he had fought for, what he had sacrificed everything to build. And she had done it so cleanly, so efficiently, that he hadn't even realized what was happening until it was too late. The board's decision still echoed in his mind, the final blow delivered with quiet finality. There had been no yelling, no dramatic outbursts. Just a room full of men who had once sought his approval, now avoiding his gaze as they cast their votes. Eleanor had remained poised, watching him with that same unreadable expression, her hands folded neatly in front of her. She hadn't gloated. She hadn't needed to. The victory was already hers. Gabriel exhaled sharply, setting the glass down with more force than necessary. He wouldn't allow himself to dwell on it. He wouldn't let himself sink into the kind of reflection that led to weakness. He had lost battles before, had faced challenges that seemed insurmountable, and he had always found a way to come back stronger. This would be no different. Except it was different. For the first time, he wasn't sure if he could win. He turned away from the bar, pacing toward the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city stretching out before him in endless lights and movement. He had spent years believing that as long as he stayed ahead, as long as he controlled the game, he could never be touched. He had surrounded himself with wealth, with influence, with people who reinforced the illusion of invincibility. And now, stripped of all that, he was forced to confront something he had spent his entire life avoiding. He was alone. His phone, which had been silent for the past hour, buzzed on the counter. He glanced at the screen, expecting another notification from the press, another call from a journalist hungry for a statement. But instead, It was a name he hadn't seen in years. Julian Mercer. Gabriel's eyes narrowed slightly as he picked up the phone, his mind already working through the possibilities. Julian had been one of his earliest rivals, a man whose ambitions had mirrored his own, whose strategies had once posed a legitimate threat. They had spent years circling each other, neither willing to fully declare war, but neither willing to back down. And now, of all times, Julian was reaching out. Gabriel answered. Julian. A low chuckle came through the line. Gabriel. I was starting to wonder if you'd pick up. Gabriel exhaled slowly. Didn't realize we were on speaking terms. Well, things change, don't they? Julian's voice was smooth, amused. I imagine you're having quite the week. Gabriel's grip tightened on the phone. Get to the point. Julian hummed, as if debating whether to continue. I'll be direct, then. I've been watching what's happening with Hawthorne Global. Fascinating turn of events. And I have to say, I didn't think I'd ever see you in this position. Gabriel clenched his jaw. Enjoying the show? Not exactly, Julian admitted. In fact, I think we might have something to discuss. Something that could be mutually beneficial. Gabriel leaned against the counter, his eyes narrowing. And what exactly would that be? There was a brief pause. Then Julian spoke again, his tone shifting slightly. I think you and I both know that Eleanor isn't just looking to take control. She's looking to erase you. The way she's restructuring, the alliances she's forming, she's not leaving room for a comeback. She's making sure you don't have a foothold left. That's not just business, Gabriel. That's personal. Gabriel inhaled slowly, considering his words. He had known Eleanor wasn't going to leave him with an easy way back, but hearing it laid out so clearly only confirmed what he had already suspected. She wasn't content with winning. She wanted to ensure he could never rise again. And you're telling me this because? Julian chuckled. Because I know you. I know you're not going to sit back and let her take everything. And because, as it happens, I have an interest in making sure she doesn't succeed. Gabriel tilted his head slightly. You want to take her down. I want to level the playing field, Julian corrected. And I think you do too. Gabriel considered the proposition carefully. Aligning with Julian was a risk. It always had been. But at this moment, when every other door was closing, when every ally had either turned against him or disappeared, risk might be the only option left. He ran a hand through his hair, exhaling slowly. What are you proposing? Julian's voice was calm, calculated. A meeting. No commitments. Just a conversation. Gabriel hesitated for only a second before nodding. Fine. Tomorrow night. Looking forward to it, Julian said smoothly before the call ended. Gabriel set the phone down, staring at it for a long moment. This wasn't how he had expected things to go. He had always imagined that if he ever lost control, if he ever found himself on the outside looking in, he would go out fighting on his own terms. But maybe that had been another illusion. Maybe real power wasn't about standing alone. Maybe it was about knowing when to shift, when to adapt, when to use the resources still available. He glanced back at the city skyline, the lights flickering in the distance. He had been a king, and now he was a man without a throne. But thrones could be rebuilt. Power could be reclaimed. And Eleanor might have won the first battle, but the war was far from over. Gabriel exhaled, rolling his shoulders back as he let the thought settle. Tomorrow, he would begin again. Gabriel Hawthorne had never been the kind of man who stayed down. Defeat wasn't a word he acknowledged, not in business, not in life. He had built himself into a force of nature, shaping his world through sheer will, bending people to his ambition, making his own rules. Now, as he sat in the dim glow of his penthouse, the skyline stretching out beyond the glass walls, he forced himself to remember that. He wasn't finished. He wasn't broken. He was just beginning. The whiskey in his glass sat untouched, the ice melting slowly as condensation formed along the rim. He had always been a man who celebrated his victories with a drink, never one to drown his failures in alcohol. Tonight wouldn't be any different. He had lost the company. He had lost Eleanor. He had lost the illusion that he was invincible. But none of that meant he had lost for good. There was always a way back. And if Eleanor thought she had closed every door to his return, she had underestimated him once again. The meeting with Julian Mercer was set for the next evening, a discreet, private location far from the prying eyes of the press. Gabriel had spent years circling Julian in the industry, their paths constantly intertwining, sometimes as allies, sometimes as rivals. He had never fully trusted the man, but that didn't mean he couldn't use him. Power wasn't about friendship or loyalty, it was about leverage. And right now, leverage was exactly what he needed. His phone buzzed on the table beside him. He didn't need to check the name. It would be Henry, still scrambling to put out the fires Eleanor had ignited, still trying to salvage what was left. He let it ring. He didn't need Henry to tell him how bad things were. He already knew. The board had turned on him. The media had buried him. His investors had moved on. His own employees were already adapting to the new regime. Eleanor hadn't just taken the company. She had erased him from it. The realization burned, but he forced himself to sit with it, to let it settle into his bones. He wouldn't be the man who wallowed in loss. He would be the man who turned it into a weapon. He pushed himself up from his seat, his movements steady, controlled. The first step to reclaiming power was understanding exactly what had been taken. He needed to know every detail of what Eleanor had done, who she had spoken to, what deals she had made, how she had positioned herself. He needed to find the cracks in her foundation before he could even think about striking back. He made his way to his private study, a space few people had ever entered. The walls were lined with dark mahogany shelves, filled with books, awards, artifacts from years of traveling the world and closing impossible deals. But none of it mattered now. Not until he had a plan. Sitting at his desk, he powered up his computer, his fingers moving over the keyboard with muscle memory. He still had access to certain records, still had ways to pull information Eleanor might have thought she had locked away. He wasn't entirely blind yet. Not as long as he had contacts who owed him favors, people who thrived on chaos as much as he did. Within minutes, he was scrolling through internal reports, tracking patterns in stock movements, reading through meeting notes from the past 6 months. Eleanor had played the long game, her moves spanning years rather than months. That was where he had failed. He had been focused on the immediate, the next acquisition, the next deal, while she had been setting the stage for something far bigger. His jaw tightened as he pieced it together. She had positioned herself in meetings that, at the time, had seemed harmless. She had cultivated relationships with key stakeholders while keeping her involvement subtle enough that he hadn't thought twice about it. She had anticipated every possible counter-move, closing off his exits before he even realized he needed them. Gabriel exhaled slowly, a slow smirk curling at the edges of his lips. It was impressive, really. Almost admirable, but not untouchable. Every empire had a weakness. Even his. Even hers. He clicked open a private folder, encrypted and inaccessible to anyone outside his circle. Inside, documents spanning years, deals made behind closed doors, alliances formed and broken. His empire had been built on strategy, and strategy meant knowing more than anyone else in the room. If Eleanor had spent years preparing for this moment, she had left behind a trail, and trails could always be followed. His fingers moved quickly, searching, cross-referencing names, looking for the smallest detail out of place. And then, finally, he found it. A connection. A name that shouldn't have been there. Daniel Lorne. The name sent a jolt through his memory. An old investor, one he had clashed with years ago, a man known for playing both sides of the game. If Eleanor had brought him into her inner circle, it meant one thing. She wasn't just securing power. She was securing insurance. Gabriel leaned back in his chair, running a hand over his jaw. If Lorne was involved, then Eleanor was planning something even bigger than just removing him. She was preparing for full domination. His phone buzzed again. This time he picked it up. "Henry," he said smoothly. "Jesus, Gabriel, you finally answer." Henry's voice was tight, exhausted. "I've been calling you all night. Do you have any idea what's happening?" Gabriel smirked slightly. "I have some idea." Henry exhaled sharply. "Then you know Eleanor isn't stopping. She's restructuring faster than we anticipated. People who were once loyal to you are jumping ship. She's making them feel safe, Gabriel. She's making them believe she's the better option." Gabriel tapped his fingers against the desk, his mind already calculating. "Then we need to remind them why they followed me in the first place." There was a pause. "You have a plan?" Gabriel's smirk widened. "I will." Henry hesitated. "Just don't do anything reckless." "Not yet." Gabriel chuckled. "You're worried about me, Henry?" "I'm worried about what happens if you try to move too fast," Henry muttered. "Eleanor is expecting you to retaliate. She's prepared for it. If you go after her now, without the right strategy, you'll just give her more ammunition." Gabriel exhaled slowly, glancing back at his screen. Don't worry. I'm not going after her. Not yet. Then what's your next move? Gabriel picked up his glass, swirling the liquid inside before taking a slow sip. I have a meeting tomorrow with someone who might be very interested in seeing Eleanor fail. Henry went silent. You're working with Mercer? Gabriel didn't answer. Henry exhaled. Be careful, Gabriel. He's not the kind of man you make deals with lightly. Gabriel smirked. Neither am I. The call ended, and Gabriel sat in the quiet for a long moment. The first move had been made. He had been knocked down, humiliated, left to be forgotten. But now, the pieces were shifting again. And this time, he wasn't going to let Eleanor dictate the outcome. He leaned back in his chair, the city lights flickering beyond the glass, his mind already 5 steps ahead. She had taken his company. She had taken his throne. But she had made one mistake. She had left him alive. And Gabriel Hawthorne had never been the kind of man to stay down for long.